Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our halacha shir. Where our subject for this evening is Motzi Matzah, one part of Leil HaSeder, and I'm going to focus on the halachot of this particular part of the Seder night. And of course, we could devote 10, 15, 20 classes to this one little topic. Any corner of halacha is subject to lengthy discussions to delve into all the opinions of the poskim. We're just going to cover the basics. Now, it says in Pirkei Avot, "Lo nitna Torah ela l'tzaref et habriot." The reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us Torah is to forge a better person, to forge a better human. The fulfillment of the mitzvahs, the technical details of the halacha, getting everything right, is intended to make you a better person. And this is true throughout the length and breadth of Torah, and every little corner of halacha has a lot to teach us about how to be a better person. Let's begin looking through some of the basic halachot of Motzi Matzah. Some of the details are going to be the same as Motzi all year long, Motzi lechem min haaretz, whenever you eat bread. Some of the details are going to be the same as eating bread all year long. It's matzah, of course, in Leil HaSeder, but many of the halachot are going to be specific to Leil HaSeder. Let's look at the material. How do I do that? I just click over here. Voila. If you want to download the source sheet, it's available on the class page at WebYeshiva.org. Since I want to focus on the halachot, a good place to begin is with the Shulchan Aruch. So let's see what the text of the Shulchan Aruch has to say. Now, I'm not going to bother in the course of this class to mention the exact sources that I draw the texts from, because you have the exact source, chapter number, paragraph number on the screen. So if you want to look it up and see what my typographical errors are, I'm not a great typist, feel free to check out the text to see what mistakes I made in typing. But it's pretty good. You know, I don't think I made any serious mistakes. Let's see the words of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, Yitain shtei yadav al hamatzah. You should put both hands on the matzah, b'shas bracha, when you make the bracha. Both hands should be touching the matzah when you make the bracha, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Why? The Shulchan Aruch explains why. Sheyesh behen eser bet etzbaot, because you've got 10 fingers on your two hands. 10 fingers, everyone knows that. And what's the significance of 10 fingers? Your 10 fingers touching the matzah when you make the bracha. Keneged eser mitzvot hatliyot balechem. There are 10 mitzvot involved in bread. To whether it's bread all year long or matzah on Pesach, there are 10 mitzvot in every piece of bread, in every piece of matzah. What are the 10 mitzvot? Well, lo tachrosh b'shor v'chamor. When you are plowing your field, you have to plow the field before you plant the seeds. When you plow the field, you're not allowed to have two different species of animal, shor v'chamor, a donkey and an ox. You're not allowed to have two different species of animals yoked together to pull your plow. You know, back in the old days, that's how they used to plow. You had animals pull the plow. If you didn't have an animal, I suppose in those days they were so chauvinist in those days. I suppose you had your wife pull the plow if you didn't have animals for it. But the halacha, the mitzvah is you're not allowed to mix different species. Of course, if you yoke onto the same yoke two different species, an ox is going to be bigger and stronger. A chamor A donkey is going to be smaller and weaker, slower, quicker. They're not going to get along well with each other. It's going to be there's going to be a lot of friction between the two animals. They're not going to get along well with each other, and when you eat the bread, you remember the mitzvah of not yoking different animals together, because it's going to make the animals unhappy. It's going to be uncomfortable for the animals. One of the things that will make you a better person is remembering, when you make hamotzi, that you have to be kind to animals. The technical name for that is tsar balei chayim. You're not allowed to unnecessarily cause pain and suffering to animals. That makes you a better person if you relate better to animals. Kraim, not allowed to mix species. If you have a vineyard, you cannot grow the wheat in a vineyard. The halacha has a lot to say about how distant the wheat has to be from the vineyard, or what kind of wall would constitute a separation. Leket, when you come to harvest the wheat, well, the corners of the field have to be left for the poor people. Shifcha, anything which falls off of the wagon when you're harvesting the wheat, has to be left for the poor people. Similarly, peah has to be left for the poor. Bikurim, you have to bring the first fruits to the Beis Hamikdash in order to acknowledge and thank God for the first fruits. You have to take Trumot and Maiserot, Maiser Rishon, Maiser Sheni. You have to take tithes for the Kohanim, for the Leviim, for Yom Tov, in order to have Simcha and Yom Tov. And of course, Challah has to be taken from the dough. Bottom line, there are 10 mitzvahs involved in making bread, and you should remember them. And this is not only in Leil HaSeder. This is all year long. When you eat bread. Now you'll notice that the Shulchan Aruch begins this halacha with the word yitain. Yitain is the first word here. Now, in grammar, most people don't care a whole lot about grammar. This is what grammarians call a jussive. Jussive means it's a kind of instruction. It's a kind of command. Let your two hands, have your two hands. Your two hands should be on the matzah. Now, this introduces, from the halachic point of view, an interesting question. What exactly is the nature of the obligation here? The Mishnah Brura points out, surely the Mishnah Brura needs no introduction, single most authoritative posek in the 20th century. Hainu de tov la'asot came. The Mishnah Brura, in his commentary on this passage, says yitain. The word yitain, the grammatical jussive form, means tov. It's good. Good idea. It's advisable. It's praiseworthy. It's commendable. It's all kinds of good things to put your 10 fingers on the bread or the matzah, so you'll remember all of these mitzvahs and make yourself a better person. That's tov. That's good. That's commendable. That's praiseworthy. But there's some distance between all of that on the one hand and obligatory on the other. Hebrew has a very rich vocabulary for telling us that things are obligatory. Chayav, muchrach, tzarich. The Hebrew has a very rich vocabulary to express halachic obligations. And the Shulchan Aruch knows how to use those technical terms where there is an obligation. None of the words of technical obligation are mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch in this context, and therefore the Mishnah Brura concludes, and this is, I just choose one commentary, but this is typical in all the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, it's not obligatory to hold the bread or the matzah in this way. It is tov. It is good to do that, commendable, praiseworthy, all kinds of good things, but not exactly obligatory. Someone who fails to do it is not guilty of violating any halacha. So if the question is, do you have to do it, having all of these 10 mitzvahs in mind? The answer is no, it's not obligatory. If you do hold the matzah in this way and have these mitzvahs in mind, have you done something good, commendable, praiseworthy? Yes, indeed you have. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Let's go on one more step in a different text from the Shulchan Aruch. Yikach hamatzot keseder shehiniham. You should pick up the matzahs in the order that they were laid on the table. Namely, haprusa, the broken one, back earlier in Leil HaSeder, in Yachatz, you broke one of them, and the broken one, ben shtei hashlemot, the broken one should be between the two whole ones. That's the order in which they lay on the table, and that's the order that they should have when you pick them up in your hands with your 10 fingers. Yochsam biyado, you hold the 2.5 matzahs, the two whole ones, and in the middle, the broken one, you hold them in your hands, yivarech hamotzi, you make the bracha hamotzi, al achilas matzah, you make a second bracha, al achilas matzah, 2 brachas on the matzah, v'achakach, and afterwards, yivtza mea shlema ha'elyona u'mea prusa, and afterwards, you break off a little bit of the top matzah and a little bit of the bottom matzah, mishtehem, and from pieces of the top matzah and pieces of the bottom matzah together, you dip them in salt and then proceed to eat them. Well, you'll notice in passing that the Shulchan Aruch calls for salt. After all, the shulchan, the table upon which you eat, represents the mizbeach, the altar in the Beis Hamikdash, and it says flat out in the Torah that the mizbeach, the altar in the Torah, should always have melach, should always have salt on it. So your table should always have salt on it, and you dip all year long the bread or on Pesach the matzah gets dipped in the salt. That's what the Shulchan Aruch said. Leil Seder is no different than any other night as far as dipping in salt is concerned. Then there's a Hagah, a note. Everyone knows that the Shulchan Aruch, the text we just finished, the 3 lines we just finished, is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, one of the all-time great Sephardic authorities. When the Shulchan Aruch was published and came to the attention of the Ashkenaz team, many rabbis on the Ashkenaz team were not so happy with the Shulchan Aruch because, not surprisingly, Rav Yosef Karo had a strong tendency to make decisions in accord with the Sephardic authorities. And sometimes there's a difference between Sephardic authorities and Ashkenaz authorities. They're not always arguing with each other, but, that's what rabbis do. Being a rabbi is a full-time job. Disagreeing with other rabbis, and the number of disagreements between Sephardic authorities on the one hand and Ashkenaz authorities on the other is immense. And therefore, Rav Moshe Isserles, this is back in the 16th century, middle of the 16th century, one of the big Ashkenaz rabbis at the time that the Shulchan Aruch was being published, added Ashkenaz notes to the Shulchan Aruch, introduced with the word Hagah, note. Whenever the word Hagah, note, appears in the printed text of the Shulchan Aruch, the words that follow are Ashkenaz notes added by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And in order to make it easy to distinguish what is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo and what is written by the Ashkenaz writer, the Ashkenaz stuff is written in Rashi-shaped letters, and the Rabbi Yosef Karo, the original Shulchan Aruch, is written in square-shaped letters. This is what the Ashkenaz poskim say. Ein ha-minhag l'tavlam b'melach. There's no minhag to dip the matzah in salt. That's the Ashkenaz position. Ashkenazim do not do that. To pat naki ein tzarich melach, the bread with the matzah for Pesach, we make every effort. I mean, the efforts are extreme. We go through extreme efforts to make sure that the matzah is absolutely pure. flour and water, and absolutely not the slightest bit of anything else. We go through such extreme efforts to make the matzah so pure, so we don't, the Ashkenaz team does not dip it in salt. Now, here you notice a big difference between the approach of the Shulchan Aruch, typical of the Sephardic authorities, and the approach of Rav Moshe Isserles, typical of the Ashkenaz authorities. The big difference between them, and this is only one of a huge number of examples, the typical difference between them is the Shulchan Aruch is almost entirely rooted in purely halachic sources. The Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rambam, the great medieval authorities say this, they say that, and on the basis of what we see in the sources, we draw our halachic conclusions. Pure halacha. That's the approach of the great Sephardic authorities. If you look in the Ramah, the Ashkenaz commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, over and over and over and over again, he talks about minhag shalom, our custom, our practice, nohagim. It is our custom in Ashkenaz territory to do it this way or that way. Minhag, the practice of the people, is extraordinarily authoritative from the Ashkenaz point of view, unlike from the point of view of the great Sephardic poskim. The great Sephardic poskim draw their conclusions, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, as much as possible from the pure halachic sources. Ashkenaz poskim, on the other hand, are strongly influenced by the minhag, the practice of the people. Now, of course, sometimes the practice of the people is just wrong, and you have to tell them to change their ways. But if there is any room to justify the practice of the people, if there's any way to justify that and explain why it's okay, the Ashkenaz poskim will always go with the minhag, with the practice of the people. Practice of the people rules unless it's flat out wrong. It has to be corrected. That's the Ashkenaz approach. The pure halachic sources rule. That's the approach of the Sephardic poskim. Now, this difference in approach, which I've just outlined, is true up till the 16th century, into the 17th century. When you get into the 18th century, things get to be a little bit more confusing. But with the Shulchan Aruch, we're still back in the beginning of the 16th century, where this distinction was still very clear between the Ashkenaz team and the Sephardic team. The Shulchan Aruch then goes on and says, Yochlam b'haseva, you eat the matzah while reclining. I don't know if you get a mirror image of me or not, but I'm reclining on my left side. If you're getting a mirror image, so I really mean to recline to the left. You eat the matzah reclining. B'yachad kazayit mikol echad. You should eat a total of 2 kazesim. And a kazayit is around the bulk of an olive, the volume of an olive. And you need from the top matzah and from the bottom matzah a kazayit from the top and a kazayit from the bottom, a total of 2 kazesim, the volume of 2 olives. Now, as I'm sure you know, there's endless talk, endless discussion among the rabbis about exactly how to measure the volume of an olive in modern measurements. They didn't have ounces back in those days. They didn't have cubic centimeters back in those days. So they conveyed the idea of a specific volume by saying it's around the volume of an olive. And as I'm sure you know, there are many rabbis today who calculate that the volume of an olive is humongous, and you end up eating huge amounts of matzah. Well, that's nice. I mean, eating matzah is a mitzvah. Can't object to that. But bottom line, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the great Rav of Yerushalayim, was asked once about the opinion of Reb Chaim of Volozhin. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, he used from the Beit Midrash of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, back in the 18th century, and he was one of the heavyweights in rabbinic history. And he used to hold that, he told everyone that kazayit, the amount of matzah you have to eat, is about the amount of matzah that corresponds with the volume of an ordinary, everyday olive, around the amount of matzah that would fit into a bottle cap, right? Like a soda bottle, the cap is about the size of an olive. That's the amount of matzah, which is really not very much. So they asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach here in Yerushalayim, he was the heavyweight in Yerushalayim in the 20th century. They asked him whether someone who is sick and has difficulty eating on Yom Kippur, that doesn't matter what the illness is, just has difficulty eating. He said, okay, for a sick person to rely upon this very small measure of an olive, and really, it's really not very much at all. To which Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach responded, well, of course a sick person can rely on this opinion, and not only a sick person, anyone can rely upon this opinion. This is a valid opinion, and anyone who wishes to rely upon it can indeed rely upon it. And then Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach told the story of the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer was the Sochachover of the 19th century in Poland. He was simultaneously one of the great Hasidic masters of Poland, and at the same time one of the great halachic masters of Poland. His halachic works are highly revered in the world of halacha, and his Hasidic works are highly revered in the world of Hasidut. He was great in both, and once he took little pieces of honey cake and distributed the pieces of honey cake. This was during the year. Distributed little pieces of honey cake to the Hasidim and commanded the Hasidim, matztah bruche, pronounce a blessing, borei minei mezonos, on this little piece of cake I've just given you, and eat it. And the Hasidim, of course, did what the Rebbe commanded them to do. And then the Rebbe said, okay, guys, now it's time for bracha acharona. You have to make an alamichia now. Well, one of the Hasidim was chutzpahdik. I'm supposed to speak in English. One of the Hasidim was cheeky and said, but Rebbe, is it proper to say the bracha alamichia on such a small piece of cake? You need at least a kazayit in order to make a bracha acharon, in order to pronounce a bracha after eating. To which the Avnei Nezer responded to the chassid, have you in your whole life never seen an olive? The bulk of an olive, the volume of a typical olive, is the minimum opinion. No, I do not intend to tell you to minimize the amount of matzah you are eating in Leil HaSeder. If you're healthy and can be strict, if it's not burdensome for you to be strict and follow the stricter opinions and need more and more and more, go for it. But if it's going to be burdensome, for example, for sick people, or people have difficulty chewing, people have difficulty swallowing, all kinds of problems which can make it burdensome for you to eat matzah, it's okay to rely upon this minimal opinion. That is indeed an opinion as well. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch says, "In eno yachol echol kishnei zeisim biyachad." If you can't handle two olives at the same time, the volume of two olives at the same time, yochal shel motzi tchila, eat the top matzah first, a kazayit from that, and afterwards eat a kazayit from the bottom matzah if you have difficulty doing it together. Now, in passing, you notice that there's a big problem here. According to the Shulchan Aruch, everyone has to eat some of the top matzah and some of the bottom matzah. Now, if we're talking just about husband and wife or a very small family, I suppose that's practical. But if you're talking about a lot of guests, yeah, you got a big family, you got a lot of visitors, you got a lot of guests for Leila Seder, well, it's just patently impossible for there to be enough matzah in the top one and enough matzah in the bottom one for everyone to get a kazayat from this and a kazayat from that. This, of course, raises the problem of how to handle this halacha if you have a large crowd for Leil HaSeder. Before we come to this issue, and it's a very important issue to resolve, let's first quickly survey the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. On the previous screen, we saw the text of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, let's survey the primary commentaries, the most important commentaries. The Taz, 17th century Eastern Europe. It's a curious thing. The first publishers of the Shulchan Aruch were Ashkenazim. And therefore, not surprisingly, all the commentaries that they printed on the Shulchan Aruch were Ashkenaz commentaries. And to this very day, that's the way the Shulchan Aruch is printed. They're very different from the Rambam, for example. The first printers of the Rambam happened to be Sfaradim. And all the commentaries they included on the Rambam were all Sephardic commentaries. And to this very day, the Rambam is always printed with Sephardic commentaries. Well, the Taz lived in Eastern Europe in the 17th century, and he says the reason you have to hold the matzahs in your hand is because some poskim hold that the top matzah is getting the motzi, and it's the middle matzah which is getting the bracha of al achilas matzah. Other poskim hold the other way around, just the opposite. And therefore, since you should hold in your hands whatever you're making a bracha on, just hold all of it in your hands when you're making the bracha. Cover all opinions. The idea is as follows. As I mentioned before, and this is an idea which is embodied in almost every halachic formulation throughout the Shulchan Aruch, if it's not burdensome, why not be strict and simultaneously fulfill all of the opinions if you can? After all, you want to be sure that you're fulfilling the mitzvah correctly. You want to be sure that you're doing the halacha correctly. And if it's not burdensome, why not follow all of the shittas, fulfill the mitzvah in a way that all of the opinions are fulfilled? Well, if it's not burdensome, why not? On the other hand, in a situation like where you might have difficulty eating so much matzah, well, there's going to be some burden involved, then we have to think about what the minimum fulfillment of the mitzvah would be. But in a case like this, just about anyone can just hold all the matzahs in his or her hand, no problem at all. The Magen Avram says you hold in your hand klakol shloshtam, all three of them. You need 2 whole matzahs because you need lechem mishnah, requires 2 whole loaves of bread all year long for Shabbos and Yom Tov, and therefore you need 2 whole matzahs. But then you also need the broken one, so you have to have all 3 in your hands. Well, we could go through all of the commentaries. They say basically the same thing. The Chok Yaakov, of course, being a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, we know that he's an Ashkenaz fellow. He says, "Ein minhag l'tabel b'melech b'layla rishona." We don't do the dipping. We Ashkenaz, and our team doesn't do the dipping in salt. Well, we understand why, because that's the Ashkenaz minhag. But the question arises, why is that the Ashkenaz minhag? Why do Ashkenazim deviate from the practice all year long, and on Pesach, all of a sudden, don't dip in salt? I said before, because we want to guarantee the purity of the matzah. But that really doesn't explain the matter, because surely the Shulchan Aruch, or Yosef Karo, the Sephardic authorities also want pure matzah. Everyone wants that. So the explanation I gave earlier really doesn't go far enough to explain why the Ashkenaz minhag is to refrain from dipping in salt. The Maharil, the late medieval Ashkenaz authority, says Mishum Chibuv Mitzvah. He says the reason we Ashkenazim don't dip into salt is because of the Chibuv Mitzvah, to demonstrate our love of the mitzvah, to demonstrate that we like the matzah. This demonstrates that we like matzah. You should live your life in a way that demonstrates that you like lulav and esrog and sukkah on Sukkos. You should live your life in a way that demonstrates that you like doing the mitzvahs, and therefore it's the matzah you want, and you don't need any other tastes involved. The Lavush, his name was Reb Mordechai Yaffa. He was one of the disciples of the Ramah, who wrote the Ashkenaz notes on the Shulchan Aruch, said that the reason is Mishum Lechamoni. In the good old days, when all was right with the world, before the corruption of modernity, back in the good old days, salt was very expensive, and only the rich people could afford salt. Think about it for a moment. The English word salary. A worker gets paid salary, daily salary, weekly salary, monthly salary, whatever. The word salary just comes from the root salis, the Latin word for salt. Back in the old days, workers were paid with salt. That was a very valuable commodity. The Yiddish word, or the German word for money is Geld, which means gold. Right, back in the old days, people were paid with gold. The Hebrew word for money is, of course, kesef. Back in the old days, people were paid with silver. Well, silver, gold, precious things. Salt was in the category of precious things back in those days, and therefore the Loaf says that's the reason we don't dip in salt, because we want to remember lechem oni. This is the bread, the bread of poverty. That's what the matzah is. Okay, now, at this point, I want to turn to the question which I raised earlier. How on earth are you supposed to do this if you have a lot of people present in Leil Seder? Well, one solution would be, of course, to have everyone around the table have their own matzahs, starting with 3 matzahs and ending up with 2 whole ones and 1 broken one. If everyone has his or her own matzah, right? Remember that this is a mitzvah which is identical for men and women, so everyone can have his or her own 3 matzahs. Well, that would be one way of solving the problem. On the other hand, that turns out to be pretty expensive. What happens in those families where only the balabayas, only the pater familias, only the head of the household has the 3 matzahs and has to distribute them to the people? Let's see what the Hakam Sofer had to say about this. Hakam Sofer, his name was Rav Moshe Schreiber, late 18th century, originally from Frankfurt in Germany. He became the Rav of, those towns in Slovakia had different names. He was the Rav in Pressburg, exactly the same town today is called Bratislava. It depends what language you speak. But he was the Rav in Pressburg, Bratislava. Today the town is in Slovakia. Of course, in Europe, they were happy to move whole cities around from country to country every few years. But today it's in Slovakia. Then it was in Hungary. Bottom line, the Sefer Mishnah Skir that we're going to quote from quotes a great rabbi who was the rabbi of Bussermin, one of those places in Eastern Europe, who says that the Chatam Sofer, after making the two brachot, Motzi Matzah, Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz, and Alachilas Matzah, after making the two brachas, he held the matzahs in his hand and made the two brachas. Then what did he do? He passed out the matzah to all the people around the table. The achakach, and only after passing the matzah around to all the people did he eat himself. Now, I don't know how many guests Mrs. Chatam Sofer was cooking for in Leil HaSeder, but I imagine it was a big Seder. He was one of the heavyweight Rabbanim, and I imagine that he had a big family and a lot of guests. Well, this means that he made Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz, Asher Ketshar Mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Achilas Matzah, and then distributed the kizesim, the proper amounts of matzah to all of the guests, and only after having distributed the matzah in the proper amounts to all of the guests, only then did the Chatam Sofer eat himself. Now think about it for a moment, and this is quite remarkable. Everyone knows that after you make a bracha, doesn't matter what the bracha is, you're making Borei Priya Eitz because you want to eat an apple, you're making Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz because you want to eat bread. What you're supposed to do is eat the apple or the bread or whatever it is, teichef, right away, immediately. No different than when you make the bracha on a mitzvah. It doesn't matter what the mitzvah is. You make a bracha on a mitzvah you want to do, you're separating challah from the dough, you make the bracha for separating challah from the dough, then immediately, teichef, you're supposed to do the mitzvah. You don't make the bracha, wait around a while, and then do the mitzvah. The bracha has to be connected as close as possible to the mitzvah. And the Chatam Sofer didn't do that. He made the bracha, and before taking a bite himself, he would distribute the matzah to all of the participants in his Leil HaSeder. Rabbi Teichtal was quoting this whole story. He says, I do it also. That's the way I do it. I first distribute the matzah before tasting it myself. And so some rabbis started arguing with me and told me, no. After you make the bracha, you have to eat at least a little piece right away before distributing the matzah to the guests. But the Chatam Sofer wrote as follows. Actually, it was his Talmidim who wrote as follows. Lakach shalosh matzot el yonai metachtana v'aprusa be'emtza. The Chatam Sofer would take all three matzahs in his hand, whole one on the top, whole one in the bottom, broken one in the middle, and he made the bracha hamotzi. The guests would answer, Amen. The guests didn't make their own bracha. The guests listened to the bracha of the rabbi and said Amen, and that's quite sufficient. Then the Chatam Sofer, the rabbi, would break off pieces of matzah in the correct volume for every guest and distribute them. And only then, after he distributed them, only then would he eat the matzah himself. Now the question is, why did the Chatam Sofer allow himself such a long interval of time between the bracha and actually beginning to eat the matzah? Well, since he was making the bracha for everyone, sort of like on Leil Shabbat or any Yom Tov meal, where the Baal Habayit typically makes the bracha Hamotzi Lechem min Haaretz for the assembled group. If the person making the bracha typically the head of the household, would eat the matzah first, it turns out that everyone is going to have to wait for the head of the household to eat first. והוא יהיה בשיהוי גדול הרבה ממה ששוכח הבוצע בחילוק הכזיסים למסובן. If we make all of the participants wait until the head of the household eats first, the total amount of waiting time, add the waiting time of all the participants together, it's going to be far greater than the waiting time if the head of the household first distributes the matzah and then eats himself. And therefore, since what halacha calls for is doing the mitzvah, or eating the bread or the matzah, teichef, immediately after the bracha, the question now arises, how are we going to minimize not my interval of time between the blessing and the eating, rather, how are we going to minimize the total amount of time for all of the participants together? Bottom line, we learn from this that the Baal Habayit, the head of the household, must disregard his own interests in fulfilling the mitzvah in the best way possible, and rather he must sacrifice his own desire to fulfill the mitzvah in the best way possible with the shortest interval between the bracha and the eating. He must sacrifice that and instead honor the guests by making sure that they collectively can minimize the amount of time between the bracha and the actual eating. We learn from this a fundamental principle of how the host is to relate to the guests. It's the interests of the guests which predominate over the interests of the host. Let me give you another example of how this works. I cannot count the number of times people have asked me the following kind of question. Rabbi, people ask, if there are differences of opinion between the host and the guest in matters of kashrut, all year long or on Pesach, if there are differences of opinion between the host and the guest regarding matters of kashrus, who has to conform with whom? Should the guest accept the standards of the host, or should the host make sure that it's the standards of the guests which are being fulfilled? The answer to this question is simple and straightforward. You could figure it out from the words of the Chatam Sofer that we just read, but there are plenty of poskim who formulate this principle explicitly. It's, of course, the obligation of the host to be sure that the guests are comfortable, and therefore it's the obligation of the host to make sure that it's the halachic opinions and practices of the guest which are being fulfilled. I'll just give you one example. Once you have one example, you'll be able to multiply examples endlessly. If we have a host who is Sephardic and eating rice in Leil HaSeder, and a guest in Leil HaSeder who is Ashkenazi and not eat the Ashkenaz minhag, of course, is not to eat kitniot, is it the guest who must accept the practices of the host and eat the rice in Leil HaSeder, or is it the other way around, the host who must see to it that the guest is not served any rice? The answer is simple and straightforward. It's always the host who must accommodate the guests, and therefore the host has to make sure that there's no rice in the food which is served to the Ashkenaz guests. If in your fantasy you could imagine a case where an Ashkenazi would be a guest in a Sephardic Seder, And if, of course, such a thing would be imaginable, if that would happen, the Ashkenazi, indeed everyone, in every case, especially the Ashkenazi in a situation like this, would be well advised to equip himself or to equip herself with a good Haggadah. If you equip yourself with a good Haggadah, by good, I'm not talking about the commentaries. Whatever commentaries you like, that's your business. But when I speak about a good Haggadah, I'm referring to a halachic Haggadah, a Haggadah which has good halachic instructions in it, step by step, halachic instructions, what you're supposed to do. If you equip yourself with a good Haggadah, then you just follow the instructions and you'll be okay, and everything will go properly. And let's say that's good advice for everyone, but especially if we have Sfaradim and Ashkenazim eating together in Leil HaSeder, it's even more important for each to have a good Haggadah, that is, a good Sephardic Haggadah for the Sfaradim, a good Ashkenaz Haggadah for the Ashkenazim with good instructions how to do things, because there are many differences of opinion between Ashkenaz authorities and Sephardic authorities on what to do at various points in Leil HaSeder. Do you make a bracha, borei puri hagofen, or borei pri hagefen, on each of the 4 cups of wine? Well, Sephardic authorities disagree with Ashkenaz authorities, and each team should follow their rabbis. If you are equipped with a good halachic Haggadah, which has good halachic instructions for your team, Ashkenaz or Sfarad, then you just follow the instructions and all will be well. The practice of the Chatam Sofer continues as follows. We're still talking about the Chatam Sofer, the one who would first accommodate all of the guests before eating any of the matzah himself. Take a look in the Magen Avram. We mentioned the Magen Avram before. That's one of the principal commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch in the outside margin, 17th century Eastern Europe. Hamisubim einam yotzim b'ti'imat habotzea le'inyan hefsek. The explanation of the practice of the Chatam Sofer is that just because the Baal Habayit is very strict and begins to eat the matzah immediately after making the bracha, that doesn't help for the guests. It doesn't help at all for the guests. Therefore, kevan da'oseh zot shelo yeh hefsek l'mithubin, therefore, since the host is distributing the matzah, or bread in Shabbos and Yom Tov all year long, since he's distributing it before eating himself, shuv have mitzorach haprusa d'lo choshev hefsek klal, since he's doing it in order that the mitzvah be best performed, it's correct to do that, and all is well. It's obvious. Zeh chaya tam Rabbeinu Rabban Yisrael Chatam Sofer. It's obvious that this was the thinking of the Chatam Sofer. He wanted to do what was best for the guests, and therefore he distributed the matzah before eating himself. Let's go on one step further. The contemporary poskim have some advice in Eitzah, some advice how to simplify and streamline Leil HaSeder. Nachon, it is correct, and once again, please notice that none of the technical words of halacha, which imply obligation, is being used here. It is not obligatory. It is not required. It's not chayav, not tzarich, not muchrach. It's nachon. It's correct. A correct plan. A good idea would be, before netilas yadayim, prepare a tray with a lot of matzah on it, and then the Baal Habayit can prepare matzah in the amount of a kazayah for each one of the participants in Seder before the Tilas Yadayim. And then, after everyone makes the bracha and perhaps everyone wants to make their own bracha. This too is a subject of minhag. Hasidim prefer the principle of mitzvah yoter bo mibeshlucho. Hasidim tend to prefer making brachas individually. Everyone makes his or her individual bracha, if possible. Everyone should make hamotzi lechem min haaretz, not just the balabayit. Everyone should make brachas as much as possible, because it's better, in general, to do a mitzvah yourself rather than have someone else do the mitzvah for you. That's the approach of most Hasidic groups. The Litvisher, the yeshiva crowd, on the other hand, takes a very different approach. Berov am hadras hamelech, the mitzvah is more glorified if many people do it together simultaneously. The more people involved in simultaneous fulfillment of the mitzvah, the greater the glory of the mitzvah. And therefore, in the yeshiva crowd, they prefer to have one person, typically the Baal Habayit, pronounce the bracha hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and everyone else just says Amen. Same thing with Kiddush. The Hasidim all year long prefer that everyone make Kiddush himself. Notice I omit in this time herself, because women in the Hasidic world don't do that. In the Litvish world, in the yeshiva crowd, one person makes Kiddush for everyone. They say Amen. Some, the Hasidim, prefer mitzvah yoter bo mibeshlucho. It's preferable to do a mitzvah yourself rather than to allow someone else to do it for you and you merely say Amen. The yeshiva crowd prefers the principle of Barov Am Hadras Hamelech. The glory of the mitzvah is elevated if everyone is doing it simultaneously, meaning one person does the mitzvah, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, alachilas matzah, and everyone else just says Amen. But if before Netilas Yadayim, the matzah, which everyone is going to need for the kezesim, for eating matzah, is prepared in advance, then you eliminate the delay for everyone, and that would be a good plan to streamline Leil HaSeder. That's good advice for streamlining Leil HaSeder, thereby minimizing the waiting time for everyone by preparing everyone's individual matzah that they're going to be eating before Netilas Yadayim. Okay, now we've spoken over and over again about the mitzvah of eating a kazayit, an olive's bulk of matzah. But you'll notice we have not defined what eating is. You think you know what eating is. Here goes. The words of the Shulchan Aruch in defining what eating means, the words of the Shulchan Aruch are as follows. Achal kechatzi zayit. So someone who eats a half of a zayit, half the bulk of the zayit, half of the shi'ur, half a fraction of the measure required, and then eats another fraction, so it all adds up to a kazayit. Yatsa, you fulfilled the mitzvah, as long as the amount of time from the beginning of eating to the end of eating is less than achilas pras, less than the amount of time it takes to eat a loaf of bread. Good grief. How long does it take to eat a loaf of bread? Who knows? What kind of loaf of bread are we talking about? But what the Shulchan Aruch says, as long as the amount of time from the beginning of eating the matzah until the end of eating a kazayit of matzah is less than the amount of time required for eating a loaf of bread, all is well. Now, of course, we want to be able to figure out how much time this is in minutes, so we can have some judgment here. The Chatam Sofer, whom we mentioned earlier, says, "Hu tisha minut, 9 minut." I guess that's the old Hebrew way of saying minutes. 9 minutes. That's what he says in one place. In another passage, the same The same Tam Sofer writes, L'chol yoter, 9 minutes, not more than 9 minutes. Less would be better, but not more than 9 minutes. Well, preferably within 3 minutes. If you can handle it, you eat the kazayat of matzah within a 3-minute period. That would be best. If there's some difficulty in that, you can't eat so fast, surely do it within a 9-minute period. That's the opinion of the Chatam Sofer. The Chazon Ish, the great Rav of Bnei Brak, the founder of the Jewish community in Bnei Brak in those days, outside of Tel Aviv. Today, when you cross the street from Tel Aviv to Ramat Gan, you cross the street again to Bnei Brak, you can't tell you're going from one city to another. It's like part of Tel Aviv. In any event, the Chazon Ish says, after quoting the Chatam Sofer, says Tamua. I find this opinion astonishing. אבל נראה דתת מנות סגי, הואיל ונפק מפומי דגון. I think you should eat it faster, the Chazon Ish says, but since the Chatam Sofer said you could stretch it out as long as 9 minutes, that's what he said, and that is an opinion which you can rely upon. Even I, the Chazon Ish says, who believe you should be much stricter and eat much faster than that, even I must agree that those who want to follow the opinion of the Chatam Sofer and stretch out the eating as long as 9 minutes from the beginning of the eating to the end of the eating, that's okay. We cannot object to that because that was the opinion of the Chatam Sofer. The Bikur Yaakov, Germany, 19th century, said it's around 1/8 of an hour. Well, 1/8 of an hour is a little bit less than 8 minutes, he held. Well, one could go on and on with different opinions. The Darchei Hora'ah says 11 minut, 11 minutes and 9 seconds. 11 minutes or 9 seconds is exactly the amount of time he thought it requires to eat a loaf of bread. According to others, 8 minutes and 6 seconds. Well, we'll go on and on and on with different opinions. The Aruch HaShulchan, beginning of the 20th century, from the town of Nowardok in Poland. He's my favorite. This is my favorite halachic book, my all-time favorite. He says Shisha v'sheva minutin, 6-7 minutes, around that amount of time. Bottom line, that when you come to do the mitzvah, you should eat the matzah quickly, if it's practical to do so within 3 minutes. That's good. Why not fulfill the strictest opinion if it's not burdensome to do so? But surely you want to eat the matzah within a 9-minute period, and for healthy people, that should not be burdensome. That should not be difficult. Of course, for people who have special problems, some consultation should be required there. Now, we understand that an act of eating has a time limit to it. It has to be within the correct period of time in order to be called an act of eating. Now, the Torah Lishma, almost surely written by Reb Chaim Yosef. Reb Chaim Yosef was the big name in Baghdad in the 19th century. He was, he's generally called the Ben Ish Chai, the name of his most famous sefer. But in the Torah Lishma, the Ben Ish Chai, the great, one of the all-time great Rabbanim in Baghdad, he was asked, someone who eats a little bit of matzah and a little bit of wine, and then the little bit of matzah goes down into the stomach, and he vomits. What happens if you eat some fraction of a kazayat of matzah, eat half the amount, vomit, recover quickly, and then you eat more? You've eaten the total amount, but you vomited in between. Or wine. What happens if you drink a portion of the measure of wine, vomit, recover quickly, and then swallow the rest of the measure of wine. Is that considered having consumed a whole measure or not? Well, his tshuva is as follows. It says in the Gemara, Achal chatzi zayit v'hekiu v'chazor v'achal chatzi kazayit acher chayiv. If you eat a chatzi zayit, a portion, a fraction of a measure of prohibited food, a little bit of pork, chas v'shalom, but not a kazayit worth, vomit, and then then swallow another small piece of pork, chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, and the two little pieces add up to a kazayit. Are you guilty of having eaten pork? The answer is yes, you are guilty. Why? Hare nehene grono b'kazayit. Because the definition of eating has to do with the food going down the throat. If the amount of food which goes down the throat adds up to a kazayit, that's an act of eating. Halacha does not demand that there be a kazayit of food in your stomach. After all, if you vomit in the middle, then you never had a kazayit in your stomach, but a kazayit did go down your throat. Therefore, the act of eating is defined by a period of time and the food going down the throat. That is the basic definition of eating. With this, we come to the end of our shiur. We've covered some of the basic halachot of Motzi Matzah. We've seen some of the vast implications that these halachot teach us. We're going to pause at this point, and I wish you a good week, and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, and eventually a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and invite you all to return to the ongoing shiurim in WebYeshiva.org. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you. Have a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
You're welcome. Same to you. Same to you.